Charlie Kirk rose from a suburban youth to become one of America's most polarizing conservative voices. As founder of Turning Point USA, he built a movement that inspired millions and enraged just as many. But on September 10, 2025, during a public event in Utah, tragedy struck. Kirk was shot while speaking. A life defined by conflict and conviction ended in violence. To understand why this tragedy happened, you have to know Charlie's life story. Charlie Kirk was born on October 14, 1993, in the Chicago suburb. His upbringing was not the tale of elite Ivy League schools or family political dynasties. Instead, his story was rooted in a fairly average suburban background. He attended Wheeling High School in Illinois and, like many young Americans, faced the ordinary anxieties of figuring out what path his life would take. For Kirk, however, one early moment set the trajectory: a political talk he gave during his teenage years. In his final year of high school, Kirk wrote an essay criticizing liberal bias on college campuses. That essay caught attention, and soon Kirk was invited to appear on Fox Business. For a teenager, it was surreal. One day, he was a student walking halls filled with lockers and pep rallies. The next, he was speaking on national television about culture and politics. That taste of influence convinced him that his calling wasn't college, it was activism. In 2012, at only 18, he founded Turning Point USA, an organization designed to mobilize young conservatives on college campuses. Starting small, with little more than a website, a mission, and a drive to be heard, Kirk spent his early years traveling from campus to campus, recruiting students and raising money. He slept in dorm rooms, ate on the road, and lived out of his car while spreading the TPUSA message. It was a grassroots grind, long hours, small victories, and relentless ambition. His gift wasn't just organization, it was communication. Kirk had a knack for boiling down conservative talking points into quick, sharp sound bites that resonated with students disillusioned by what they saw as liberal dominance in universities. Soon, Turning Point USA was on hundreds of campuses nationwide. By his early 20s, Kirk was no longer just an activist. He was the face of a movement. But movements that grow this quickly attract not only followers, they attract critics. And for Charlie Kirk, criticism would become as defining as praise. As Turning Point USA grew, so did Kirk's profile. He became a regular on Fox News, conservative podcast, and eventually launched his own show, The Charlie Kirk Show. His message was clear: America was in a cultural war, and young conservatives had to fight back. He spoke passionately about free markets, patriotism, the Second Amendment, and faith, framing his mission as saving America from progressive decline. His rise was meteoric. By his mid-20s, he wasn't just an activist, he was a celebrity in conservative circles. He spoke at massive conferences like CPAC, advised politicians, and became a close ally of Donald Trump. He positioned himself not just as a commentator, but as part of the new generation of conservative leadership. But with fame came controversy. Critics accused Kirk of oversimplifying issues, spreading misinformation, and fueling division. Protesters regularly appeared at his campus events, heckling or trying to shut them down. Social media became both his greatest tool and his greatest battlefield. Supporters flooded his feeds with praise, while opponents attacked him relentlessly. This polarization created an aura around Kirk. To his base, he was a fearless truth-teller, standing up against woke culture and progressive institutions. To his critics, he was a dangerous provocateur, someone who thrived on stoking outrage. The stronger he leaned into his role as a culture warrior, the louder both sides became. And that noise had consequences. The anger Kirk provoked wasn't just online, it followed him into real life. Security at his events tightened. Threats became common. His speeches were often met with protests that grew heated. Kirk's rise was unstoppable, but the hate he inspired raised a chilling question: how long before words turned into something darker? Charlie Kirk built his brand by embracing controversy, but the clashes that defined his career also made him one of the most polarizing public figures in America. His critics saw him as opportunistic, someone who exaggerated problems like voter fraud or immigration to fuel outrage and rally support. His defenders argued he was simply saying what others were too afraid to. Kirk faced backlash for comments on election integrity, pandemic policies, and issues of race and gender. Each time, his words sparked firestorms online and in the media. Mainstream outlets blasted him as reckless, while conservative outlets celebrated him as courageous. The split was absolute. He wasn't just a political commentator anymore. He was a symbol of everything people either loved or hated about modern conservatism. On campuses, his events often turned chaotic. Supporters lined up to hear him speak, waving flags and cheering. Protesters gathered outside, chanting slogans, holding signs, sometimes clashing with attendees. Kirk himself leaned into the tension. He welcomed debate, even confrontation, believing it showcased his courage in hostile territory. But beneath the bravado, the hostility was real. Students threatened him. Online users posted violent rhetoric. Law enforcement sometimes had to intervene to ensure safety. The reality was stark. Kirk's beliefs made him a target. He lived in a climate where politics had grown so extreme that disagreement often blurred into hatred. Each headline, each viral clip, each controversial soundbite added fuel to a fire that was both his greatest weapon and his greatest risk. And as history has shown, when words ignite passion and anger this intensely, the possibility of violence is never far behind. By the mid-2000s, Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA had exploded in influence. What started as a scrappy grassroots project became a sprawling political machine with chapters on hundreds of campuses across America. The mission was simple yet powerful: challenge the perceived liberal dominance of universities and give young conservatives a voice. For many students who felt isolated in their beliefs, TPUSA was more than an organization. It was a lifeline. Kirk proved himself a master strategist. He understood that politics was not just fought in Congress or at the ballot box, but in classrooms, on social media, and in the hearts of young people. Turning Point USA became famous for its free speech campaigns, often setting up provocative displays that drew crowds, controversy, and inevitably media coverage. Whether it was a table with the phrase "Socialism sucks" printed in bold letters, or rallies where students waved American flags in defiance of their peers, the formula was clear: provoke debate, dominate attention, and recruit. Money followed. Wealthy donors saw Kirk's potential to mold the next generation of conservative leaders. By his mid-20s, Kirk was not only speaking at universities but rubbing shoulders with billionaires, celebrities, and top politicians. His presence at the White House during the Trump years was a clear sign that the suburban kid from Illinois had become part of the conservative establishment. But influence came with backlash. Progressive organizations accused TPUSA of harassment, of sowing division, of weaponizing youth politics for partisan gain. Investigative articles scrutinized the group's funding, its tactics, and its ties to political operatives. The controversy only amplified Kirk's brand. Every time critics accused him of being dangerous, his supporters rallied harder, convinced that the attacks proved his importance. By now, Kirk was no longer just an activist. He was a leader of the culture war, shaping not only students, but national political conversations. His Twitter, now X account, reached millions. His podcast became one of the most listened-to conservative shows in the country, and his name was synonymous with the new right. But the louder his influence became, the sharper the hatred against him grew, and that hatred would eventually follow him off the internet and into the real world. In 2024 and 2025, Kirk launched what he called the American Comeback Tour. It was part speaking circuit, part political rally, and part cultural moment. He traveled city to city, campus to campus, drawing thousands of young conservatives eager to hear him speak. For his supporters, the tour was electrifying, a chance to see Kirk live, to feel part of something bigger, to stand together against what they saw as a hostile cultural environment. But for his opponents, the tour became a magnet for protest. Outside nearly every venue, demonstrators gathered. Some carried signs accusing him of spreading hate. Others shouted slogans, calling for him to be deplatformed. College administrators debated whether to even allow him on campus, citing security risks. Law enforcement often lined entrances, forming barriers between cheering students and angry crowds. Kirk leaned into the tension. His speeches often addressed the protests directly, framing them as proof of censorship and intolerance. "If my ideas are so dangerous," he would say, "why are they so afraid of you hearing them?" The audience roared. Each clash only strengthened his narrative. But behind the fiery rhetoric, security concerns mounted. Staff members admitted that threats were growing more serious. Kirk himself acknowledged in interviews that his safety was always on the line, but he refused to back down. On September 10, 2025, the tour brought him to Utah Valley University. The setting was tense but familiar. A large crowd under a tent, enthusiastic students inside, protesters outside the gates, and police providing security. Kirk was mid-speech, taking questions from the audience when the unthinkable happened. A shot rang out from a distance. Panic erupted. Within seconds, the man who had built his career on being heard in public spaces was struck down in one. The details of that day are still being pieced together, but eyewitness accounts paint a chilling picture. Around 6 p.m., as Kirk stood under the tent, addressing hundreds of students and supporters, a crack split the air. At first, many thought it was something falling, a pop from a speaker, maybe a burst balloon. But then the screams began. Kirk clutched his neck, blood visible as his team rushed to his side. Chaos rippled through the crowd. People ducked under chairs, others bolted for the exits. Some students froze in shock as police officers shouted commands and pushed toward the sound of the shot. Witnesses reported seeing the flash of a rifle from a rooftop roughly 200 yards away. Security rushed Kirk off the stage, but the damage was catastrophic. Paramedics attempted emergency aid on site before transporting him to a local hospital. Meanwhile, police locked down the campus. Helicopters circled. Officers stormed nearby buildings. By the end of the night, authorities confirmed they had a suspect in custody. The motives remained unclear, but speculation swirled. Was it political hatred? Personal vendetta? Something else? For those present, the motive hardly mattered. The experience was traumatic. Videos circulated online within minutes, showing the panic, the screams, the frantic attempts to save Kirk. Social media lit up, with supporters calling it an attack on free speech and critics urging caution until facts emerged. By the next morning, news outlets around the world reported the tragedy. Charlie Kirk, the activist who had dedicated his life to public political speech, had been shot while doing what defined him, speaking to a crowd. Whether you agreed with his message or despised it, the reality was unavoidable. Words had led to violence. The immediate aftermath of the shooting at Utah Valley University was chaos, confusion, and then shockwaves rippling across the nation. News networks broke into programming, social media platforms flooded with shaky videos of panicked students running from the tent, and hashtags bearing Charlie Kirk's name trended worldwide within minutes. America had witnessed many political confrontations before, but the image of a high-profile activist struck down mid-speech was something that rattled even the most cynical observers. Statements from political leaders poured in. Prominent conservatives mourned what they called a direct attack on free speech and democracy itself. They described Kirk as a martyr for his beliefs, a man who had spent his career standing in front of audiences and taking questions, even from those who despised him. Former President Donald Trump, with whom Kirk had built a close alliance, released a statement condemning the violence and framing it as proof that political hatred had gone too far. But reactions weren't limited to the right. Across the spectrum, voices of all stripes condemned the shooting. Progressive leaders who had often clashed with Kirk publicly expressed sorrow, calling the violence unacceptable. President Joe Biden urged calm and unity, reminding Americans that while debate can be fierce, resorting to violence crosses a line that threatens the very foundation of democracy. Yet, beneath the calls for peace, the tragedy quickly became political. Debates erupted about whether rhetoric on both sides had gone too far. Conservative commentators argued that years of hostility toward figures like Kirk, protests labeling him dangerous, and the vitriol on social media had created an environment where violence became possible. Progressives countered that the issue wasn't ideology, but the broader epidemic of gun violence in America. Investigators revealed little in the early days, saying only that a suspect was in custody and that the investigation into motives was ongoing. This vacuum of information became fertile ground for speculation. Was this a politically motivated assassination attempt, or was it the act of a lone individual consumed by personal hatred? Until the facts emerged, narratives hardened along partisan lines. Still, one thing was undeniable. America was once again staring into the face of political violence. For supporters of Kirk, the shooting was a wake-up call about the price of conviction. For critics, it was a chilling reminder of how heated rhetoric can escalate into real-world bloodshed. Either way, the fallout placed Charlie Kirk's name at the center of a national conversation about where America's divisions were leading. In the days following the shooting, analysts, commentators, and ordinary citizens alike began asking a painful question. How did it come to this? How did a young man from the Chicago suburbs, who built an organization meant to amplify conservative voices, end up the target of a sniper's bullet on a college campus? The answer lies in the escalating climate of political polarization. For years, Kirk thrived in the role of lightning rod. His rhetoric was sharp, confrontational, and unapologetic. He openly criticized progressive policies on issues like immigration, race, and gender, often in ways that inflamed his opponents. His supporters cheered his bluntness, seeing him as fearless. His critics accused him of courting outrage and sowing division. Both sides grew louder with time, feeding off each other. But in an age of digital echo chambers, words don't exist in isolation. Sound bites are clipped, shared, amplified, often stripped of nuance, and rebranded as rallying cries. Kirk became a symbol. For some, the brave warrior fighting woke culture, and for others, the embodiment of every everything wrong with American conservatism. That symbolism turned him from a person into a target. Security experts noted a disturbing pattern. Threats against public figures have grown dramatically in recent years. Politicians, activists, and commentators across the spectrum report increased harassment and credible threats. The normalization of anger, shouted at rallies, tweeted in all caps, broadcast on cable news, erodes the boundaries between disagreement and hostility. In such an environment, it only takes one individual to turn rhetoric into violence. Kirk's case became a textbook example of this dangerous cycle. His tours drew protests not just because of his message, but because of what he represented. To many young progressives, he wasn't just Charlie Kirk the activist. He was the face of their perceived enemy. That level of animosity created an atmosphere ripe for tragedy. The tragedy also forced reflection among his supporters. Was the confrontational style that defined Kirk's career also part of what placed him at greater risk? Or was it simply inevitable that someone willing to stand unapologetically in the public square would eventually face danger in a world increasingly defined by division? There were no easy answers. What was clear is that Kirk's shooting wasn't just about one man. It was about the broader climate of a country where political debate has become warlike, where disagreement too often morphs into dehumanization, and where tragedy is no longer unthinkable. In the wake of Charlie Kirk's death, the conversation shifted from how it happened to what it meant. His supporters mourned a warrior who had dedicated his life to mobilizing young conservatives, often against overwhelming cultural odds. They spoke of his tireless tours, his endless debates, his ability to inspire students to speak up even when campuses felt hostile. For them, Kirk's life was a testament to courage in the face of constant criticism. His critics, though, faced a different reckoning. Many who opposed his ideas expressed deep sadness at his fate, recognizing that no disagreement justifies violence. The tragedy forced even his harshest detractors to acknowledge the human cost of a climate where political rhetoric blurs into real danger. Turning Point USA, the organization he founded as a teenager, vowed to continue his work. Leaders pledged to keep his vision alive, framing his death as a rallying point for the conservative youth movement. For young followers, his story became a narrative of martyrdom, proof that speaking boldly for your beliefs carries risks but also meaning. But beyond partisan responses, Kirk's shooting ignited a larger reflection about America's future. His life represented both the potential and peril of political activism in a polarized era. On one hand, he showed how one individual could build a national movement from scratch, shaping culture and politics through sheer will. On the other, his death highlighted the dangers of a society where public figures are vilified to the point of becoming targets. What remains of Charlie Kirk's legacy will depend on how the country chooses to remember him. Some will hold him up as a symbol of conservative resilience, a man who paid the ultimate price for speaking his mind. Others will remember the controversies, the sharp rhetoric, the divisions he embodied. But all will remember the way his story ended, a young activist silenced not by debate but by a bullet. As his family grieves, his followers march on, and his critics reflect, one truth lingers. Charlie Kirk's life and death are a mirror for America itself, a nation of fierce convictions, dangerous divisions, and voices that refuse to be silenced, even when silence comes too soon.